Great. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this session. Can mining be environmentally neutral? So we were all talking about in the Ethical Gems Suppliers group about topics, and we were talking about environment, and we have suppliers who come at this from very different views, very different regions, and are able to talk about various ways that we can even begin this conversation. Environmentally neutral. We're always being told mining's not sustainable. Okay, we understand that. The hole in the ground is going to need to be digged up, filled back up after it's been dug. But what about the environment? What about making it neutral during mining? Let's go ahead and introduce everyone this morning. We have Brian Cook, Ian Bone, and Stuart Pool. Why don't you each do a little self-introduction, which I tend to prefer, and do maybe a quick fragment of what your view is on this, and this is your elevator pitch, who you are and how you're coming at this environmental question. Brian, let's start with you.
I don't do well in elevators, but mining environmentally neutral, that's another broad question. Essentially, I think what we're involved in, colored gemstone industry, the mining is typically low impact relative to other large scale, medium scale mines, and especially if you compare to agriculture or timber extraction, for example. I'm not going to get into gold mining. That's a whole separate subject, I think, because I specialize in the gemstone industry. The gold mining is a big problem because of the mercury and the deforestation and invading people's territory, for example. I would briefly, and so I'm involved in Brazil. I have a mine claim that I initiated in a mining community, which resulted in helping the other locals become formalized and legal. That was the first step. And again, our impact on the environment is quite small because we're digging shafts essentially straight down into the earth and then following veins. And so we have tailings that come out of the ground and dispersed around. The only thing that we can do there is not trash the place, because in a lot of artisanal mining communities, there's a lot of trash. There could be diesel spills. It's just, a lot of places don't have a consciousness about the pretty environment. It's like, we're mining, we're doing this. But we try to be conscious about not leaving trash, plastic, etc. around. Secondly, we've started some nurseries to grow native plants that we try and get reestablished into the tailings, which is difficult because tailings are pretty nutritiously poor. So we have to, learn how to work with plants that work on those tailing piles. And then the broad spectrum of environmentally neutral, I think it gets down to what other activities you may be doing that would counter any environmental degradation or using diesel, etc. And that, for me, it's through agriculture. We grow food, and we do it in an organic or regenerative way, which sequesters carbon into the soil. And so that's what we're doing. So take it away, Ian.
Thanks, Brian. I want to talk a little bit about Central Queensland. That's my home space, and that's what I know about. And I want to talk a little bit about how I see gemstone mining potentially being environmentally neutral. But before I do that, I want to talk more briefly in terms of relativity. And again, just building on some of Brian's remarks here, Australia, Queensland is renowned as a resource country. We dig up things and export it to the world. Central Queensland is one of the biggest coal mining areas I guess the world has seen. I think we've got about 50 odd coal mines within the region of Central Queensland. It's a huge export resource for us, and of course it gives us our standard of living that we have as a so-called developed country. However, there are consequences to that, and environmental degradation in terms of extraction of coal, particularly, leaves massive scars on the environment. Now, what I'm getting to here is that has a relative higher impact than gemstone mining will ever have. That doesn't mean to say it's right, or doesn't mean to say we can't do anything. And in fact, what it does mean to say is we can take a leadership role, I think, in the gemstone mining by showing that we can do things, and that we are doing things, or some certain gemstone miners are doing things or taking initiatives to lessen their environmental impact and their footprint as of the result of their mining activities. So that's the first thing. I think there's a relative issue here. The second thing is a historical issue. And historically, mining has always had an environmental impact and will always have an environmental impact. Merely by digging holes in the earth, it has a result. We see impact in the environment as a result of mining. Again, that doesn't mean to say it's acceptable. What it means to say, though, that it is a fact. It is part of humanity's existence in terms of extraction of materials, resources, gemstones. So what it means is we have to be more conscious about this, and then I think we are today more conscious of what we ever have been. We meaning the users, but also we meaning the producers, or we meaning the miners themselves. So after Stuart and after Brian speaks again, I'll talk a little bit about, I think, what some of the people that we know are doing to try to ameliorate the environmental impact that they have in their gemstone operations. Stuart.
Stuart, can you hear us? Okay, great.
Thanks, Ian.
We can hear you.
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Okay. So my business, 1948, we source the majority of our gemstones from either Sri Lanka or Tanzania. So both of those countries are engaged in artisanal small-scale ASM mining.
Stuart.
And yes.
You know what? You're sounding a little garbled. Do you want to try and turn off your screen and leave your audio on to see if that helps us hear you a little bit better, because your screen's frozen. There you go. Let's see if that's better.
Okay, is that
I
better?
think it's better. Yes. Thanks.
Okay. It's probably better for everyone if I don't have the video.
No. Go ahead.
That should be my standard policy. So I think in Sri Lanka, we're fortunate that we have probably one of the countries where ASM is cited as, it's one of the best examples really of that type of mining. And so there is a lot of legislation in place. There are a lot of rules, regulations as a government agency to oversee gemstone mining specifically. And so we're able to obviously work within that framework when we're working with our mining partners there to ensure that we're assessing the land before we start mining, during the mining operations, and then after the mining is finished. And part of that assessment is, of course, the environmental aspect. So I think we're on a very good footing there, and I can go into more detail about that as we get into the questions later on. I think in Tanzania, we have a little bit more of an evolving situation. I think obviously the circumstances are slightly different. Tanzania is a much larger country to start with, so monitoring is more difficult. And I think it's fair to say that maybe the emphasis on the environmental side is not perhaps as strong as it is in Sri Lanka. So we've got slightly different environments within which we operate. But I think both of those countries are still doing that, undertaking the mining in quite responsible fashion, and I think there's certainly there's a willingness, shall we say, to improve. I think in Sri Lanka, probably they see themselves as working in quite an optimal way, based probably on the fact that they've been doing it for hundreds of years, and the environment there is still pretty healthy if you go there. And I think in Tanzania, where a lot of our miners are slightly less experienced, so it's less of a part of the culture and the heritage there, that they are looking at ways in which they can improve how they mine in terms of the environment. So so some interesting, slightly different situations that we have. I think lessons can be learned in both directions. I think we can go into those in a bit more detail.
I'm going to jump in. So everyone's given yeah, no, that's great. I think everyone's given kind of, we have so many different landscapes, and you're talking about two different landscapes in what you do. So I'm going to start jumping in with a few questions, if that's okay with everyone, because we have so many comparisons here. And I'm going to start with your comparison of Sri Lanka and Tanzania. So I think we started with Brian, was talking about specific things. What can you do with tailings? What can you do? We haven't gotten to filling up mines, which I think is always a big question at the end. How do you reclaim the mine? But what can you do with tailings? Specifically, can you, working in planting and working in agriculture? So can you compare, can we have a comparison of maybe, and then we'll talk about the other countries in comparison, Sri Lanka to Tanzania specifically, like specifics, what do they do with the tailings in Sri Lanka? How do they have reclamation plans in place in Sri Lanka? What kind of transparency can we have between established regions like, Australian Queensland to other regions that maybe need to understand what's happening? So can you kind of give us your comparisons there, and then we'll work in the other countries with it. What exactly does Sri Lanka have in their plan that you would like to see in other areas that are developing their mines?
Okay, so in terms of the Sri Lankan mines, they are very, very tiny operations. So they can be small kind of open cast mines or small shaft mines, but we're not talking about any great depth. So it's probably of the order of, between 5 and 20 meters depth, something like that. So the amount of earth, if you like, that comes out of the ground is relatively small. Of course, the amount that we retain ourselves, the gemstones that we hopefully find, is a tiny, tiny amount of material compared to the earth that we move. So the vast majority of the earth is stored on site. The duration of the mining projects is relatively short. So you might only mine for 1 or 2 years. So you can hold the earth, and you're also required in Sri Lanka to refill your pits or your shafts as you go around the plot, the mining plot. So you're extracting a small amount of material, and then you're refilling the holes and the tunnels with that material. So basically it goes straight back, within the matter of months, it's going straight back into the ground. So there's no need to take it anywhere or do anything with it.
That's a different mining cycle than if you're saying that it's a matter of months when you're opening and refilling holes because it's so small. That's probably vastly different than maybe, if I can just shift it and ask Ian, in Queensland with a larger mine, probably where you have more of a small scale mine, your times that you're taking, the dirt out and having the tailings and putting it back in is probably much longer term, correct?
Susan, it depends on the situation. Let me give an example.
Okay.
Firstly, let me explain the sort of typical gemstone mining operation. It tends to be small family business, small partnership arrangements, maybe an excavator, maybe 2 excavators, maybe a dozer, maybe a dump truck. These are all very small scale relative to the large industrial mining situations, but of course large scale relative to artisanal mining. So sort of fits sort of in between, if you like, the massive big industrial mining complexes that you see, the BHPs, the Rios, all those big mining companies, and the artisanal mining. So you sort of have a fair degree of mechanical mining, mechanical implements, I should say, to mine with, or to extract with. And generally, as I say, it's a family operation or maybe a partnership, 2 or 3 guys getting together. So what tends to happen is, firstly, before they actually go and mine, they have to get permission. So any of our mining operations are underpinned with permissions from the government. So the Queensland Department of Mine have to apply for mining exploration permits and then mining leases. So within all of that process, there's a requirement for them to actually deliver a mining plan. And in that mining plan, there's a whole sequence of activity as to what the person or the party's obligations are. So those obligations meaning, okay, we're going to mine a certain area, we're going to undertake that for a certain period of time, and then we're going to backfill within a certain period of time as well. So that depends on the situation that stands now. Now, that hasn't always been the case. I mean, previously, 50, 100 years ago, I mean, that wasn't the case at all, where, you know, it was a bit of a free-for-all. And you can see those evidence of those places still today, where those mine pits are still open, spoil heaps are still there. But in today's world, I think we've come up with a situation where clearly legislative frameworks are in place to ensure that this is the case. Now, doesn't always apply, because sometimes if people don't meet those obligations, no one's got the money to do the work to fill back in the mine if they go broke or if they walk away from it or for some other reason. I mean, there are some deposits taken from these people, but it generally is not enough to actually do the reclamation work if something goes wrong. But you're generally right. It takes longer, over a period of years perhaps, for reclamation to actually be enacted. And so then, therefore, if a mining activity is undertaken at a particular mine location, they may be mining there for 2 or 3 years before they move on to another location, and it could be that the reclamation takes that period of time. Now, there's one other point here, and it's interesting, and I think it's very important to make. The mining that's undertaken in our part of the world is in locations that are very remote and very arid, and really, in most cases, have no other purposeful utility, I suppose the word is, in terms of productivity. You can't grow grain there. You can't grow anything else. There's no agriculture. You'd be lucky to run 1 or 2 head of cattle per hectare if you're lucky, mate. You know, it's very arid country.
And snakes are the wildlife there for you?
Well, it's just the reality of the world. And these places are way out in the middle of nowhere. And that doesn't mean to say they oughtn't be reclaimed, because there is a natural environment there. And and there are obligations to make sure that happens. But what I'm saying that people need to understand is that there is no immediate productivity cost there in terms of not reclaiming the land. What the issue is in terms of reclaiming it back to its best condition and how that is gone about. And I think this is what we're talking about when we talk about environmentally neutral, is actually taking it back to its best condition. So that, again, is underpinned with a framework of legislative responsibility and cost. And again, I can talk a little bit about the actual practicalities of how that happened after we get around the table.
Can I make some comments here?
Yes, please.
Just to emphasize what Ian just said. So in Brazil, artisanal mining is what happens with the sites is very dependent on how much resources are available. And typically, the garimpeiros and miners do not have the money or resources to reclaim things. Now, if you go through the process of staking claims and you file the reports and you have to have a plan and you have to get your environmental license, which I did, that's a process, and it's fairly expensive. So it's a combination of people that do what I do, and some of the local landowners that have more resource, they can do that. But then it's also a combination of a free-for-all. So all of that's happening at the same time. The word artisanal mining is just that. It's the art of mining. And the art of mining goes back thousands of years. It's a very old profession. And so I think I want to keep that in mind, that the folks that are doing artisanal mining are actually artists in what they do, because you have to cobble together what resources you have in order to go dig something out. And there's a lot of creativity in how people mine, from very primitive to, if you have resources for a dump truck and a backhoe, that's a whole nother level. Well, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I'm talking about neutrality. One thing I want to make a point that I try and educate people is that mining is going to happen. It's going to continue to happen. It's what our civilization is built on. So, and the other thing I want to say is that mining in general has a bad rap. There are definitely bad instances, big problems. There's been disasters around mining. It happens. But overall, in the big picture, it's a very small impact compared to other industries that are happening around the world. And when you get into artisanal mining or gemstone mining specifically, it's really a pinprick. It's very small compared to what's going on. So we're actually in a good situation as an industry, producers of gemstones, that our impact is fairly low. And it really gets down to what we can do at the source as miners, what we can do to help the locals in those mining communities, how we can inspire them to do better with what they have. And getting back to neutrality, for me, it's about teaching agriculture, teaching regenerative agriculture, so that it will be there when the stones run out. And that's what we're doing in Brazil. I'm involved also in the Amazon, and I'd like to show that I'm involved in an area that's a tin mining area, and a byproduct is topaz. And so here you have a little larger scale. You have huge pumps and water blasting, and you have excavators. So that's another level. But even there, when you look at the impact on the environment, there's no chemicals, so there's no pollution in that sense. Even there, it's still very small pinprick on the overall landscape, because if you zoom out in a satellite image, you'll see the forest is gone because of agriculture, not because of mining. And that's, so it's relative. And I want our industry to understand that we can demonstrate that, the mining of gemstones is very small impact. And we do what we can to try and help at the source, to teach, to give them the resources that they can improve that particular site.
I think that's well taken. And I think in talking, of course, we come in at this with talking about gemstones and where we are, and all supporting artisanal and small scale mines in, the many different regions. But I think what's even more interesting about this conversation is even within these models, each one is so different. Like, Ian talking about Queensland and how arid it is in a desert. And, I was saying snakes, but you don't have the same sort of maybe different wildlife and human conflict, which comes into the environment as well as you may in Tanzania, where you may have to, be careful that an elephant doesn't get hurt in, accidentally walking to your mine site. Everybody has such a very different dynamic. And Brian, you haven't really even gotten into the regenerative farming that you do in Bahia, which is can help, the farming can all help, the getting to carbon neutral
Regenerative agriculture simply means that you build soil in time, which means you have better quality food and you're sequestering carbon in the soil. And as the world moves in that direction, which it will, it has to, even large scale agriculture, that's going to be one of the biggest efforts to combat carbon in our atmosphere.
Yeah.
Another thing is carbon credits. That's going to be gaining some traction. In the Amazon, study was done just a few years ago, and it was estimated that the combination of cattle and grain, which is the main deforestation that's happening, cattle and grain, the dollar benefit per year per hectare is approximately $125. Now, so carbon credits on a standing forest, if it was calculated at $10 per ton, that would be approximately $5,000 per hectare per year.
Yeah.
So saving the forest, keeping the forest standing is much more valuable than mowing it down for cattle and soy. Of course, the problem is cattle and soy is quick cash, and there's huge lobbies and huge industries supporting that. So it's going to take, the world changing or pushing in a new direction, and that goes to bringing for Brazil, leaving a forest standing. Then you have the opportunity to teach the local traditional communities, being indigenous river communities, small landholders, to make a lot of money from the products that the forest gives. And so that's the direction that Brazil has to go.
Yeah.
And the rest of the world is trying to push that way.
Absolutely. Let's have you help make that happen too. I'm going to take it back to Stuart, so we can hear you, Stuart. So you started off with some mine comparisons. Do you want to maybe let us know what could you take that you've learned in Sri Lanka, and what would you put in Tanzania or some of the other ones? What can you tell us? Are you thinking about carbon neutral work in Sri Lanka? Is this something that can be taken elsewhere? Will you chime in with your thoughts on this?
Yeah, certainly. I think that on the Sri Lankan side, there is more that we can do in terms of the things like environmental assessments and looking at the potential impact, because the mines are often quite close to places that do have habitation and agriculture and things going on. So quite different from, say, the situation in Tanzania and as Ian said, in Queensland as well. So I think we would be able to maybe pilot that kind of activity. Although, again, as Brian said, it's a lot down to the resources of the miners. So I think probably what we're touching on a much bigger topic here. I think that historically the miners have not been receiving necessarily the right value for the materials that they've been producing, and I think we're all aware of that in our different businesses, and we're trying to address that. And so I think if we, as we're doing in Tanzania, is that we're bringing the stones to the market, we're getting a fairer price for the miners, and that means that then they have more resources at their disposal, so they're more inclined to be able to do the activities that have been seen previously as beyond their scope or beyond their resources and beyond their remit almost, because they've got more money coming in, which is ultimately, of course, what all of our miners are doing this for. They're trying to make a living. And so I think what we can do as responsible suppliers is we can, firstly, as I say, work with them to get more cash flow to them, but also something we talked about in the first session earlier on today is about putting resources, money back into the educational side. So I think that, for example, in Tanzania, we have a much more receptive audience potentially through the mining association there, in terms of educating them about all types of things relating to the mining, but especially in terms of using the mine safely and restoring the land afterwards. I mean, that's something that we need to probably look at a lot closer. In Sri Lanka, I can imagine that it would be quite difficult
we're starting
because
to have trouble
as I said before, they've
understanding
been doing
you.
it a long time.
Sorry.
They have minimal
I'm
impact.
starting to have trouble understanding you. I'm sorry.
Okay.
We were following you for a long time, and then the audio started to get garbled. I think, sorry about that. I think what we're hearing again.
Sorry.
I think what we were hearing again before it started to be harder to understand is again going back to yet another structure, and for some miners and some mine sites, the environmental ask for reclamation and for some of these other things is beyond what they can do. So I think us just talking about this and bringing this up, and I think we're at the time, if we were at a half an hour, am I correct? I think that kind of we can conclude that we're in a better spot as artisanal and small scale gemstone mine, suppliers and representatives. Everyone here is in a better spot because environmentally, it's not as there's not as much degradation as with a large scale mine. There's not the problems with the gold mines, and there are solutions, but the solutions in the Amazon are going to be different than in Queensland, and in Sri Lanka, they're going to be different than in Tanzania. And the solutions, I think we all need to understand and support some of these innovative ways that people are thinking around it, and also understand and the different landscapes, and maybe have more of these discussions holistically about what different environmentally aware mines and miners can do to help others that are just beginning their journey in mining in their country. So thank you, everyone.
Just a remark. I see two remarks. I see a number of questions up on the chat. We do need to respond to those questions in some medium and in some way. And I just want to say that I think we can address those chats. There are some relevant points there and some important points that we can follow up. And the next thing I do want to say is that, we knew probably that half an hour wasn't going to be long enough to really dissect this topic. And I think the group will consider probably at the next fair the continuation of some of these conversation topics. So just to the people that are listening to us today, this is not the conclusion. This is not the conclusion of this conversation. This conversation is going to go further forward. And I think that we'll continue on with these sorts of conversations, particularly on the topics that we don't necessarily have a full coverage of, because I've got more to say as well.
Yeah, so exactly. So the point is once this session ends, come over to to the lounge and jump on a table and let's continue the conversation. And as Ian said, this is an ongoing discussion. When we do our live shows in Tucson, all this will be on the table. Eu estou vendo duas brasileiras, bem-vindo. I'm glad to see some Brazilians showing up. This is great. So come join us at the tables. Is this session ending already?
We're supposed to end 5 minutes ago. We can, if you all want to do the questions before we go to the table, I'll leave it up to you all as panelists. I think there was one about a carbon, are there good carbon credit initiatives to recommend? I would recommend, I would say Andrea Hill, who's on here and who's running this, has done more research into carbon credits than I have. I don't know if anyone else has a good carbon credit program. Brian?
Yeah, there's an amazing program developed in Brazil, which is very, it's new and it's progressive and it's a whole beautiful concept. It's called MOSS, M-O-S-S. And they are offering carbon credits where the money that's invested for the carbon credits is funneled into projects that are actually happening on the ground in Brazil, in the Amazon. So let me just write this.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. That's awesome. I think I've heard of moss before. Maybe
Yeah.
you told me about it, but I think, yeah, that looks great.
So yeah, that's a way. You know, I'm actually going to try and help them find
Great.
investors through some of the large jewelry companies.
Excellent. Another question was, are there initiatives around this, like Better Without Mercury? And I would ask if anyone else knows about them. There's, you know, Pure Earth is doing a fantastic initiative around gold, you know, in Peru, in the Madre Dios section area. So, but gemstones, I think there have been initiatives. There's been some writing, as we can hear, definitely coming off of this panel. There needs to be a holistic look at different regions in what can be done in the ASM gemstone area, because obviously the ability, when you have, you know, the suppliers that you have here of people to be able to go in and really do something that's real is there. We really could make, I think, easier, you know, it's easier to make great things happen in gemstones, I think, colored gemstones. And especially when you have people as passionate as the group here. So am I missing any active environmental initiatives around colored gemstones besides Brian's and Zavahia and the ones here? I mean, we need more, like what everyone here is doing, right?
Like I did mention the project in Hondonia, and that's Swarovski funded that.
Oh yeah.
That was a beautiful project. Of course, it stopped once the pandemic started last year. So we're looking for ways to continue that, and it's all based on people buying topaz from there. So that's another discussion.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
So, all right, great. Well, I think that we got everything in from the chat. So I think if anyone has more questions, go to the tables, and Stuart and Ian and Brian are going to be at their tables, and they can answer your questions as well. So in fact, go there and re-ask your questions there at the tables. And
just click on lounge. It's called the lounge.
Oh, the lounge, sorry.
The lounge. We don't have cocktails yet, but
go to the lounge. You can have a coffee at the lounge.
Coffee or cocktails. Depends on what time it is.
All right. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, we'll see you there.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.